Thank you for joining us today for the live webinar entitled USA Visa, Immigration and Travel Regulations. Any changes under Biden administration, ? I'm Tony Imsenhuber. I'm with the Austrian Trade Commission in Los Angeles, and I will be the moderator slash interviewer. Right now, the US travel ban from Europe is still in force, but there are ways for travelers, business travelers, to enter the US legally, using, for example, the national interest exception. So how can I get this national interest exception? There are confusing rules about which visa holders may enter, which may not. Do I need a negative corona test to enter? Answer yes. How about quarantine? All those questions are best posed to our presenter slash interviewee today. Unfortunately, Bernie Wolfstorff, who was originally going to join, is currently traveling, but we have Richard Yemm with us. He's a partner with Wolfstorff Rosenthal LLP, and it's one of the most recognized law offices in the country, specialized in immigration law. They have 7 offices worldwide and employ over 40 attorneys. The Austrian Trade Commission has relied on their expertise for many, many years. Richard, welcome to the session.
Thank you. Thanks for that.
Before we dive into the subject, one brief, or maybe 2 brief housekeeping matters. There will be a 20-minute Q&A session because we've received numerous questions already by email at the end of the presentation. So feel free to use the question function to pose your question. Also, the session is being recorded, and everyone who registered for this event will automatically receive a link to the video probably on next Monday or Tuesday. So here we go. First question to Richard. What is the current status quo of the travel ban, and how can business travelers deal with it? Richard?
So it's a great question. And right now we essentially have 2 travel bans. I'm going to focus first off on the most important one, which is really the kind of COVID-related travel ban side of things, what they often call the Schengen travel ban. This one, you may have seen news. You know, there was talk that Donald Trump had taken it back, but then when Biden came in, he basically said, no, we're gonna keep it going moving forward. The current travel ban was brought in January 25th. It basically covers anyone from any of the Schengen countries and Brazil and South Africa, which was just added as well, in addition to China. The idea behind this travel ban is that you have to be able to show that you have not been in one of those countries within the 14 days preceding you coming into the country. If you have, technically you're just not allowed to come in unless you meet certain either exemptions or exceptions, which we'll get into in a second. I just sound very similar, but slightly different. But that's the main travel ban we're working with, is just you need to be able to show you've not been in one of those countries within the 14 days before you come in. That does mean what we have seen a lot of people doing is going to a third country to quarantine for 14 days before entering the US. And I think, you know, we've seen people go to Cancun in Mexico or something like that, spend 14 days there, and then enter the US from that point. So the idea is then when you're coming into the country, you can show that you were, you know, you weren't in one of these kind of bad or listed countries on the list within that 14 days before coming in. So that's the idea. Now, this ban applies even if you have a valid visa, even if you have, a valid ESTA, anything like that. In most situations, you're still going to need a national interest exception or an exemption. So yeah, do you want me to go into a little bit on the exemptions
Yes, please.
now?
Yes.
Sure. So first off, exemptions. You're exempt from the travel ban if you are married to a US citizen or a green card holder. If you are under 21, child of a US citizen or green card holder, if you're parent of an under 21-year-old US citizen or green card holder, or if you are the under 21 sibling of another under 21 US citizen or green card holder. So, if you're married to a US citizen or you have a US citizen kid here, great. You don't need to worry about this. In those cases, you're exempt. You don't need to apply for an NIE, national interest exception. You can basically just come in, but make sure that you have evidence of, that you qualify under that exemption. We did see people where they tried to come in and they didn't mention the fact that they're married to a US citizen. And if immigration doesn't know, they're just going to say, well, no, you're not coming in, you're from one of those countries. But if you have the marriage certificate, if you have the birth certificate and proof of that, you're exempt. So that's the first one. The national interest exception is for pretty much everyone else. And this is where you basically submit and you request that you be allowed to enter the country despite the fact that you're coming from one of these Schengen countries. So this would allow you to come directly from, let's say, from Austria to the US without having to go through a third country for that 14-day period. Now, typically, a national interest exception is limited to humanitarian travel, public health response, national security. Also, there's kind of an economic recovery or bolstering key components of the US transatlantic relationship. So there's kind of scope there to work with. If you can show that you're coming in to work for a US company and help the economy rebuild, maybe you're coming in to help hire people, this side of things, there's kind of an area that you can kind of get in under there. Practically, with the national interest exception, with Austria, you basically just send an email. So it's consulate.vienna@state.gov. You send them an email. It has to be at least 3 business days before you travel. And if it's granted, it will only be for a single entry. So you only have that one time that you can come in with it, and it's only valid for 30 days. So this is a little bit frustrating for some people because, you often want to book your travel in advance. You're only going to be able to get this natural interest exception done, most 30 days before. So yeah, this is kind of how it works. And from a practical standpoint, you send an email to that email address with a copy of your passport photo page, copy of your approved visa. Like, this is assuming you have a valid visa. Copy of your valid visa, copy of your ESTA approval, and a letter regarding why you qualify for this national interest exception. So that would be maybe a company letter explaining, look, hey, this person's needed to come in and help run the company or hire lots of Americans or something along those kind of lines. If you don't have a valid visa, then you're going to have to go through the standard process of going to the embassy to apply for a new visa. And at the same time, most of the time, you would also be applying for your national interest exception then. So you'd be prepared to kind of present evidence at that point. I think, right now for national interest exception, the key ones that they're looking at that are eligible, business travelers, investors, academics, J1, students, journalists, treaty trader. Those are the kind of key ones they're looking at. And typically those are going to be a good one. They also, if you are resuming ongoing employment with the same employer, typically they think it's undue hardship on the employer if you're unable to come in. So again, there's kind of areas there where you can point towards and say, but this is why I qualify for the national interest exception. So I always get that confused because it's so similar, but slightly different. But yeah, back to you, Tony.
Okay. So I would also add that it seems that the U.S. Embassy has been very lenient in the past months in issuing those national interest exceptions. Visiting a trade show was deemed sufficient, so it's. I think they are doing a good job in providing the national interest exception, and some of them are issued within a couple days, 2-3 days, so if you have the visa, you don't even have to show up at the embassy. I think that's important.
Exactly. You can basically just email this through. We actually get the question a lot because oftentimes the email response you get kind of approving it doesn't look particularly official. It's very much just an email saying you've been approved for national. You can print that, bring it with you. Don't worry, that's going to be okay. It's all updated in the system, so you should be good on that front. But yeah, that's that side of things. But yeah, with Vienna specifically, as of February 8th of this year, they've resumed limited appointments. Now, B2 is still suspended. So just in case you don't know, B1 is visitor for business. B2 is more visitor for tourism or visiting family or friends, that side of things. Now, they are a lot better at giving you or allowing a national interest exception for a B1 if you're coming for business, like you said, kind of a trade show or business meetings, that kind of thing. They're much more likely to give you one for that than they are for a B2. B2, if you say you want to go to Disneyland, which I don't think is open anyway, but you know what I mean? If you're coming to visit people or do that kind of thing, that is a lot tougher, unless, they may be able to look at it if there's a very, dire humanitarian need, you're coming in because someone's on their deathbed or something like that. But other than that, you're looking more at the B1 side of things. Also with Vienna, they're currently, because of quarantine restrictions, they've basically limited visa issuance to people that are physically present in Austria. And also just to kind of help out people that, might have started their visa application process and everything's been postponed because of COVID, the visa application fee that you paid will stay valid until September 30th of next year. So that's the non-refundable visa fee. It's safe to some extent. Like, you should hopefully by September of next year, this will be behind us. Hope I'm not being too optimistic with that. But yeah, it will stay valid. So, once things open back up, you should be able to move forward on that.
Okay, so I have to ask the question, even though you probably don't know the answer. When will this all be over? When will the ban be lifted?
So it's a great question, and I wish we knew. The new ban that was put in place January 25th by Biden doesn't have an end date. It's basically, when he says that it's done, it will end at that point. So you would think that that's really going to come down to, exactly, how long this side of things takes, how long until things start opening up again. I mean, now with the vaccine and that side of things, hopefully it's sooner rather than later, but we just really don't know. And I think one of the problems as well with embassy visa issuance is really that if everyone was vaccinated today and everything was great and the embassy opens up for business, it's gonna take some time because a lot of these locations have been closed or limited operations for extended periods of last year. So there's a lot of people that had appointments or, have been pushed back because of this. So even once things open back up, it could take a while. But I do have one thing that I can say in terms of an end date. So I mentioned there were two travel bans. There's the travel ban that I just mentioned, the Schengen area, there is also an economic, we call it kind of more of an economic or labor ban on specific visa types. Now that is due to expire March 31st. We don't know if it will go beyond that, if Biden will kind of extend it further. I like to think he won't, because this is kind of a leftover from the previous administration. But yeah, that one could be ending pretty soon. Now, am I okay just to go into that one a little bit? Just
maybe
Yeah.
before
Sure.
we go into this, let's finish off with this NIE and the whole package of how you travel to the United States. A big issue being quarantine restrictions. I know they are local, but how should an Austrian traveler approach this question? They need to plan. Richard?
Yes. So as of January 26th, now they've kind of added basically all US bound air passengers need to be able to present, and this is 2 years and older, need to present a negative COVID test. And this is a PCR or antigen specific test. And it has to be done within 3 days of departure, or be able to show if you've had it before, that you've recovered, that side of things. Now, that is a fairly new thing, but that applies to everyone. That's not just people on work visas, green card. This is green card holders. This is U.S. citizens. Everyone has to make sure they can show that. But once you are in the U.S., once you've been able to show that test, you've maybe got an NIE, you travel to the U.S., you have to then self-quarantine. Now, the CDC is recommending kind of a self-quarantine for at least 7 days, but there's a little bit of a difference, when it comes to, as you mentioned, state by state restrictions. For example, California, LA County, they basically say 10 days that you need to quarantine for. New York, I think, is a mandatory 10 days. I almost said 10 years there, which would be a little bit too long. Mandatory 10 days, but you can test out of it. So if you're able to, like a few days in, and you can show, you got a test done, you can then get yourself out of that kind of area. But yeah, there is a pretty good link on the CDC website where you can basically type in the address that you're going to be able to show that, this is where I'm going, what are the restrictions there, what do I need to do when I get there? Because one of the things that particularly people from abroad don't find a little bit strange about America is you've got federal law, which kind of oversees the entire states, but then you've got state specific and even county specific. LA County has still got the stay-at-home order, that side of things. So it's that side of things just to keep in mind. But yeah, did you want me to post that link in the chat, or we'll send that through?
We are going to send it out with the video link together.
Perfect. Okay.
Okay. So I guess the link sends you off to a specific county health department link, as I understand it. These county health department websites are not always easy to decipher, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they're using languages like should and shall and must and may. So my experience is that most of the quarantine regulations are recommendations. They are strong recommendations, but you mentioned a few mandatory examples. So I guess that's important to know. And if an Austrian company is not sure as to how to interpret that language, they can send us an email, and we'll make sure we get it interpreted correctly.
Yeah, and another thing is also because of the state situation in the United States, there may be additional restrictions just going from state to state. So, yes, you might quarantine coming into New York, but then if you're traveling to California, you may have to do so again, because this website goes into detail about, California will say if you're coming from out of state, if you're coming from out of country. So just be aware. And I think, with these things changing all the time, it's just best to, save that link somewhere and use it when you're traveling in.
Okay, Richard, I think we can move on to another important topic, and that's the typical business visa like E1, E2, and L. Our experience has been that especially L visa has been frowned upon by the Trump administration. I'm not sure how this happened because the law hasn't changed. So can you enlighten us as to what happened and whether this situation will change under Biden, but maybe also give our audience a quick overview about the requirements of each of the visas I mentioned.
Sure. I think the main thing right now is fingers crossed that it gets better. So you're exactly right. The law itself hasn't changed, and there's talk that there might be some comprehensive immigration reform, but that's all kind of out there, so we won't get into that in a huge amount of detail just yet. But yeah, the law hasn't changed, but what the Trump administration put in place was kind of a policy which was known as BAHA, B-A-H-A, which basically stands for Buy American, Hire American. And the idea there was that whenever an officer was looking at a specific case, they had to adjudicate it with this kind of philosophy behind it. So you saw a lot of requests for evidence that kind of were maybe, really very strict on the application, on the applicant. Is this something that an American could be hired to do? Why do you need to transfer this person across? So that was one of the things. Now, to give you kind of an overview of those specific visas, the L1A and L1B, this is an intercompany transfer visa. So the idea here is you have to be able to show that you worked for at least 12 months for a company abroad, which could be anywhere outside of the US. You worked there for at least 12 months in either an executive, managerial, or specialized knowledge position, and you're now being transferred to an affiliated company here in the US, where you're going to work in a executive, managerial, or specialized knowledge position. So there's a couple of key things there, obviously showing the affiliation. It can be common ownership. It could be the parent company is abroad and the subsidiary is here, or whatever the situation is. Those are all okay, and that tends to be pretty easy to establish and not something they challenge too much. Where they get into it in more detail is really showing that the position is executive, managerial, and especially specialized knowledge. So an executive position, you need to be able to prove that the position abroad was suitably executive. You were responsible for the direction of the company, overseeing big picture type stuff. For a manager, they typically want to see that you're not a first line supervisor, that you're managing, ideally you're managing someone who's managing someone else. So in that situation, org charts are great. If you can show, here I am, here's like 3 levels below me, that's always good. And they're very focused on how many people are you managing, both abroad and in the prospective position here in the US. So that's the manager side. There's some add-ons that we could go into where you can show you're a functional manager, you're managing an important function for the company. They're a lot tougher on those. And then specialized knowledge, which honestly, they have always been very, very tough on those cases. Really just because it's kind of open for a lot of interpretation, almost abuse sometimes, because anyone can pretty much make the argument that this person knows how we as a business do our accounting or how we do something. So people can make that argument that we're transferring that person here because they know how we do things. And immigration is going to need a little bit more than that. They're going to want to see, why is this something very specific to your organization, that this couldn't be done by someone else. So it's definitely been tough, and it's definitely got tougher with the previous administration. We're hoping, Biden has come out and issued a statement basically saying that they really want to try and encourage immigration. They actually revoked the Baja thing, and they basically changed it to more of a just buy American rather than hire American. So the focus is supposed to be on, encouraging immigration, encouraging these businesses where people are able to come out and work and help kind of grow US businesses from that perspective. So that's the L1 visa. Just so you know, there's restrictions. L1A is 7 years max, L1B is 5 years. Going on to the other two, you mentioned E1 and E2. E1 is a treaty trader visa, which, if you were listening earlier, E1 treaty trader and the investors are good ones for NIE, for a national interest exception. E1, basically, you're going to have to show that you're coming to the US, you've established a company, or you're establishing a company. The company in the US, and this is for E1 and E2, has to be at least 50% Austrian owned if you're an Austrian national and you're coming out. And that has to be Austrian nationals. So it's kind of a strange one. If the person owning the business is here in the US, they're Austrian, but they have a green card, doesn't work. It has to be kind of, maybe it's owned by Austrian nationals abroad or Austrian here on an E2. So you need at least 50% ownership. E1 is focused on trade. So for an E1, you really need to be able to show that there's going to be substantial trade between the home country, Austria, and the US, which in that case can be imports, it can be exports. We've done, scrap metal exports, we've done wine imports, like whatever it is, they just want to see that there's going to be a lot of trade, and that's quantity and kind of quality. So value of trade, number of shipments, that kind of thing. So that's what they're very focused on. Yes.
Interestingly, does that include services as well?
Good question. It could. It really could. And we've even done, made an argument that sometimes even contracts or something like that being, going across could be an argument under that side of things. But I think immigration is a little bit old-fashioned. Sometimes they really want to see, how much goods are being transported back and forth. So I would say that would be your focus. And typically with both these E1 and E2, they want to see this company is established, and hopefully it's going to be hiring Americans or hiring people growing. The E2 is similar and probably more utilized, I think, than the E1. The E2 is an investment visa. So this doesn't matter whether you're trading or whether you're what you're doing. They want to make sure that you have spent a lot of money in setting up this business. Now, typically, we tend to see, and correct me if you've seen different amounts, but we tend to see about 200,000, 150, something like that. If that's being spent, and this depends on the type of business, but if it's a smaller business and you've spent that much already, then that is typically considered to be a substantial investment for E2 purposes. But it has to be irrevocably committed. So you can't just transfer that money to a US bank account and say, look, the money's there. They want to see that you've spent this. And that could be on equipment, on lease, on inventory, and on doing your website, on personnel, whatever it is, you have to show you've already spent that money. So you're committed to doing this. The other aspect of the E2 is you also have to show this company isn't going to be marginal. A marginal company would be seen as one that's really just being established to support you in the US and support your family. So yeah, the best way to kind of get over that is to show that, hey, we've already hired 2 or 3 Americans, or we're going to be hiring people, expanding, opening new offices, this side of things. All of that is useful for an E2. But yeah, we always get the question, what if I spend all this money and then we don't get the visa, and that's honestly one of the issues. Immigration, they kind of hold all the cards, and until they see you've spent that, they're not going to give you the visa. So it's one of those kind of tricky situations, and also one where the B1 that we mentioned earlier, the business visitor visa, can be useful, because one of the reasons for having a B1 can be to come in to look into potential investment opportunities or to sign contracts. So we often will help someone get a B1, 6 months, come in, spend some money, sort things out. And then once the business is kind of, to some extent, ready to go, you go back abroad to apply for your E2 visa to allow you to come in and to actually work for that company. So, yeah.
Okay. So one question about E2, E1, E2L visa in COVID times. So what's the current situation? I think the US Embassy has started to accept new applications already.
So the US Embassy is, yeah, they've kind of opened back up to some extent for appointments. This kind of goes into what I was talking about earlier, the second ban, which is due to expire in March. Right now, there is a ban on issuance of H's, L's, and J visas at the embassy abroad. Now, you are exempt if you were here in the US on, I think it was June 24th, or you had a valid non-immigrant visa or immigrant visa on that day. So right now, they're not issuing those visas unless you come into one of the exemptions, but we're hoping that changes from March time. Now, what that means, it doesn't necessarily have a huge impact on people right now, because obviously it could take quite a while to get an appointment at the consulate because they're so backlogged. We can still file an L1 petition, because the L1 specifically is a petition-based visa. So what that means is we have to file a petition with immigration here in the US, get an approval on that before we're able to, before you're able to really go apply at the embassy for that visa. So we can still kind of do that initial process, and you get the approval. You then have to wait until they're back processing L visas to be able to go in and apply for that visa. E2s otherwise are pretty much straightforward. E1, E2 is basically, typically those applications are filed directly with the consulate. So you actually prepare everything, send it to them, they adjudicate everything. So yeah, that's an alternative way, and those aren't affected by this economic ban.
Okay. All right. I guess we move to another topic, and that's major immigration reform. Is there anything on the horizon that would change the way Austrian business travelers travel to the United States?
So this is a tough one, just because we really don't know. There's definitely been talk of, like I mentioned, some kind of comprehensive immigration reform, which could, very much change a lot of things. I also mentioned, the revocation of the BAHA policy, the Buy American, Hire American, and change to more of just a Buy American thing. Hopefully with that philosophy, you'll see the officers at immigration maybe start to adjudicate cases a little bit less strictly. The problem is, with all of these things, it takes time, doesn't it? I mean, you can remove the top people, they've changed, but the mid-level and lower level people that are actually adjudicating the cases are still there, and takes them some time to maybe realize how, maybe if there is a change in ethos or whatever it is, to for that to kind of percolate down. The other things that have changed, obviously Muslim ban has gone, but that's its own separate thing. Like I said, they are trying to welcome immigrants more, and actually review the regulations and see if they can help with some of that stuff, and trying to streamline the citizenship process. But honestly, I don't really see too much in the way of changes specific to Austrian nationals or Austrian businesses coming out. I think, given the economy, because of COVID, I think there is going to be increased emphasis on investment. And I think potentially, or I would definitely hope that investment visas are seen as, critical in helping the economic recovery of the country. But yeah, that's about it right now. It's kind of one of those things. Obviously, once COVID is kind of over, hopefully there might be more of a shift towards maybe immigration changes that could benefit people. But yeah, nothing huge just yet.
All right. With this, I think we are entering the audience question session, and I have a whole list of them.
It's my favorite part.
Let's start with the first one. I'm paraphrasing here. I'm currently in the US on a J1 visa. How can I switch to a work visa? That's a tricky one.
So good question. Going from a J to a work visa is actually what I did. You might notice I have a bit of an accent, remnants of one. I'm originally from the UK, been out here about 12 years now. I initially came out as a J1 trainee. I then switched to an H1B work visa. Now, typically switching from a J, and this might get a little bit too specific, and we can go into it. If you have questions, you can email me. But some J1s are subject to a 2-year home residency. If you are, you pretty much have to go home for a period or apply for a waiver. In some situations, you can switch, but it's often not recommended because the whole point of the J1 is that you're only coming temporarily for a short period. Then you're going to go back home and, basically use what you've learned through your training here to benefit your home country. But we are approaching H1B season. March is the registration period. If you did have a company interested in hiring you, they could look at putting in a registration for you for an H1B. If there's a lottery, if you were selected, it wouldn't kick in until October 1st, and you would best idea would probably be to leave the country to activate the H1B once it goes through. But that might be an option down the line, is just to look at H1B.
And H1Bs are currently tough ones, I understand.
Yes, yeah. So there is a lottery every year because they're so oversubscribed. It's the main professional work visa. So they changed this last year, and basically March, for the first few weeks of March, it's a registration period where the employer submits a registration for you. It's something like $10 to do the registration. Then immigration runs a lottery April 1st to decide whether they're going to look at your case. If you get lucky, you get selected. Then there's 2 or 3 months to actually, for you and the employer, to put together the actual application, file it to immigration, and then have them approve, hopefully adjudicate and approve. And if they approve, you're good. You've got the H1B and you go from there. But yeah, bit of a lottery system. And I mean, you mentioned changes. That could be a change for next year. They've talked about replacing the lottery with a system that will select people based on salary range. So if you've got a higher salary, you're more likely to get an H1B than the lower ones, which will be really bad for entry-level people. But yeah, that's down the line.
Thank you, Richard. So I'm another audience question. I'm on an E2 visa that will expire in 3 months. Is it better to extend the visa using US Embassy? Well, going back to Austria, or should I petition while in the US at the USCIS?
So great question. Really, this depends on what your situation is with regards to travel. Because you can file an extension here, but there are very clear restrictions on that. So if you file an extension or change of status for an E2 here in the US, the max you can ask for is 2 years. If they approve it, you've got your approval notice, but that approval notice is basically worthless if you leave the country. So it's fine if you're okay with staying put here for the next couple of years. But the problem is next time you leave the country, you're gonna have to go through that Vienna consular process. And I've got clients that have just, because they don't feel like, because E2s are a little bit easier sometimes here in the US than going to the embassy. I've got people that have just extended here, but it means they're stuck here. And the idea is once they get the company to a point where it's big enough to kind of make the consular application, they'll then go for that. But yeah, it's more likely to go with the consular process if possible. If you just don't want to travel right now and you want to extend, then an E2 extension definitely can work.
Got it. Does the NIE process work for traveling with ESTA as well? I think so.
Yes.
Yeah.
If you have a valid ESTA, just for those that don't know, ESTA, gives you, it's basically visa waiver. So it allows you to come in without actually having to go through the visa process. When you enter the country, you're only stamped in for 90 days. Whereas the B1, B2 is very similar to ESTA, other than it's an actual visa, it's actual visitor visa. And when you use one of those and you enter, you get stamped in for 6 months. And you can actually extend that if you need to while you're here. Whereas ESTA, you didn't come in on a visa, you can't extend, you can't change, you have to just be here for the 90 days. But ESTA is only available to certain countries and certain people.
Thank you, Richard. So any ways for Austrians to visit family? So an Austrian having a son or a grandson in the US, how should they go about it?
So good question. I mean, there is the exemption that I talked about. If you have a son under 21 who's a US citizen here in the US, you're exempt and you could technically travel. I think if they're not, then you're kind of out of luck, because I think you're unlikely to get a national interest exception, but you can do the quarantine in a third country. So if you were to, extend your trip, go to Cancun for a couple of weeks or whatever it is, then enter the US from there. The one thing I would say, and I always say on this, is just be careful and just watch out, for any updates, because, right now, we've seen a lot of people going through Mexico, quarantining there for 2 weeks, then entering, but things can change. If there's suddenly a huge spike there, it could change and go back the other way. So just keep that side of things in mind, just in case. But yeah, that would be it.
Mm-hmm. So 2 weeks in Cancun isn't bad either, right?
Yeah.
Which visa do you recommend for a technician, apparently one who is on site repairing equipment, to stay 10 to 12 months? And probably the corollary to that is how long can you actually stay on a B1 visa without leaving the country?
So this is a good question. It gets a little bit complicated. B1, you can, like I mentioned, you come in, you get stamped in, you're allowed to come in for 6 months. So you can stay here for that period. You can apply to extend that with immigration, ask for another max of 6 months. One thing we've seen on that, because we've got a few people that are here that don't want to travel because of COVID, they just keep extending. You file the extension, make sure you calendar the 6 month extension date that you're asking for, because some of those extension applications are literally taking 7 or 8 months to be adjudicated. As long as you file the application and it's received by immigration before your current B2 expires, you can stay here while it's pending, but only up until that 6 months. Once you get that 6 months that you asked for, you would have to potentially file another one based on the pending one to allow you to stay here longer. So we've had some people, it gets approved, but the approval expired 3 months ago, and then you've kind of been out of status for a period. So just bear that in mind. Now, for a technician coming in, tough one, because ideally you're going to probably want some kind of work visa, whether an E2 or an L1 or something like that would work, depends on the nature of the the company you're working for and that side of things. Because B1 is really, it's a business visitor, but it's supposed to be for business meetings, meeting with business associates, signing contracts, doing that side of things, attending conferences, not necessarily for actually working. There is something called a B1 in lieu of H1B, but that is a little bit complicated and something that we probably wouldn't want to go into right now, just because they've been very, very strict on whether they will give those or allow those. So typically in these cases, if you're coming to meet with people, you could do with an invite letter from the US saying, we need this person to come out, meet with our team in person for these reasons. And, this is, we couldn't do it without this person being in person, especially with virtual working now. A lot of people are like, well, can you do this over Zoom or something like that? So just make sure you address that.
Well, maybe a question that should be posed together with the last one is, many people think they can just take a short trip to Mexico and then re-enter, and the 6 months period starts again. What could be Canada. My understanding is that this is against the law. What's your take?
So it's not necessarily, I wouldn't say it's against the law as such, but they're getting wise to it. So, this used to be the thing where someone had ESTA visa waiver, they would be here for 90 days, they'd go to Mexico, turn around, come back. They called it flag polling. You just basically go around the flagpole, come back, and you get stamped in for another 90 days. Now, they're not doing that most of the time. If you're only out for a short period, they will most likely just stamp you in for the time you had left on your initial one. So if you're very close to the end, you're suddenly going to face a panic to try and leave the country very quickly. And yeah, it's got to be a meaningful departure. Now, it can work in some situations. If you do go, you're there for a few months, or longer period, you come back, they may stamp you in again for 6 months. But one thing with the B1, B2, and even the ESTA, just to keep in mind, is that they are looking, they're getting better at tracking exactly how long you've been spending in the US, and the stamps are all there. So, they ask you, how long are you staying? How long have you been spending here? There's no hard and fast rule with regards to how long you're supposed to be here. And that's good and bad, because that means the officers have a lot of discretion. They can look at it, and if they think that, hey, you've been spending too much time here, you've been spending some of them will kind of use a little bit of a test just for their own sakes. Hey, if you spend more than 6 months here in any year, then that's bad. Technically, as long as you're coming and it is a temporary trip and you are only coming for the right reasons, you're not going to be working here and you're going to be leaving straight after, you should be okay. But the longer you spend here, the more likely you are to run into issues on that front. So just keep that in mind. And just a bit of a correlate to that, we've also seen immigration, and this has been, it's been mainly in the Trump administration, but a little bit before, is they can search. I mean, they've always been able to search your bags. So if they search your bags and find a business card with a US address on, that could be used against you to say you're working illegally in the US on this visitor visa. But what they've started doing now as well is checking cell phones. So they will ask you to show them your cell phone. They can actually open it up, go through emails and social media and everything else. And if they find something in there, which they have been doing, they've been finding WhatsApp messages about drug use or whatever it is, they can use that against you. So be careful on that side of things when you have that. They see it as, this is just baggage. You're bringing in baggage or luggage, and we have the right to look at that. You have the right to refuse, but then we can say we're not going to let you in. So that's definitely something just to be aware of.
So no Fourth Amendment protection, right?
No, unfortunately not. There's a bit of an argument out there, but as of right now, they're still, I mean, I think what they do have to do is they do have to put your phone into airplane safe mode. So they only can look at what's cached to the phone. They can't kind of go off pulling additional emails or social media and stuff. So Yeah, make of that what you will. But yeah.
Okay. A question just came in about quarantine regulations, whether they are enforced.
So this is a tough part with America. Like, we have seen that they haven't necessarily been forcing this as much as, you know, certain other countries have been. You know, I would still say, you know, if it's a mandatory 10-day, they probably are going to ask you questions about what your plan is when you're coming in. And they're going to want to see that you've made arrangements on that side of things. And this also applies to when you're applying for the national interest exception. You know, those cases are often a lot more likely to be approved if you can show, hey, I'm coming to the US, here's my plan, I'm going to quarantine in this location for this period of time, and then I've got to go here, and this kind of thing. So if you can show that you're actually abiding by those rules, you're going to be in a much better situation. I think CDC also, by the way, recommends that you do get tested for COVID 3 to 5 days after you arrive in the US. And that's pretty much for everyone. But again, it's kind of a recommendation, but just throwing it out there.
And what happens if you actually test positive in
So
this situation?
if you test positive in the US, we mentioned earlier, you know, there's could be insurance issues, because if you need medical treatment, I know we've seen people running into issues getting or setting up travel insurance to come out to the US because of this risk. I don't think if you test positive, it's not a situation where they're necessarily going to kick you out, but they are going to recommend quarantining for the period of time and not traveling. And you could run into issues if you then try to return to your home country, if that home country has their own specific restrictions. You know, if they require you to show a test before you can travel there, or anything else like that. So just keep that side of things in mind.
Okay. How does quarantine look like? Can I book a hotel? Do I have to stay in the room 24 hours? Or am I allowed to get food? Good questions. Do you have experience?
No food. You have to starve for 2 weeks. So again, it sort of depends on where you're going. I think at this point, it's kind of a self-quarantine that doesn't seem to be in most places like a strict, hey, you've got to stay in this specific hotel, like you've probably seen with Australia and New Zealand, where, you know, it's very regimented. Here, it's still a little bit flexible on that. It's a case of you need to show self-quarantine for that period. And yeah, I don't think too many other issues on that. In terms of getting food, I mean, you know, I think outdoor dining has reopened here in LA recently, but other than that, depending on where you go, a lot of places are still closed.
So our experience has been, I mean, not personal experience, but learning from Austrian visitors that people are being checked. When they enter California, they have to supply an address where they're staying. And health people are calling. Of course, if you have a cell phone and you are sitting in the Starbucks, also, but they are calling the hotel to make sure that you are in the hotel that you say you are.
Nice.
Okay, so a very concrete question about an Austrian company that organizes a physicians conference in the United States. They need to scout the location as soon as possible. I guess the conference will take place in May of this year. What should they do? Would they qualify for NIE?
So I think this would probably come under kind of like you mentioned, you were seeing B1 trade shows, people being allowed in for that. This makes sense to me as a B1 under the business visitor. If you have a valid B1 visitor, you can maybe email the consulate and ask for the NIE to be approved on the basis that, you know, you're coming in for business need. The physician side of things, you know, if this is something you can also point towards and say, this is you know, somehow related to healthcare in America, I think that will definitely kind of strengthen your case. But yeah, that would be my best bet on that.
Okay, a question about the NIE from a practical point of view. If you are going to travel more than once within a month, do you need 2 NIEs?
Yes.
Okay.
It's single entry. So yeah, if you need an NIE, you're probably going to be needing to apply each time. And remember the 3 business days before the date of travel. So chances are you use it one time, come in, when you leave, apply again. I mean, the hope would be if you were approved before, you hopefully would be approved again. But yeah, by the way, I did want to just mention the 3-day, I don't think I went into this in much detail, but in terms of the 3-day having a COVID test, they use 3 days as opposed to 72 hours. The idea being really just to put a situation in place where it's not so dependent on what time you did it and what time your flight is, that kind of thing. So it gives you a little bit more flexibility on the COVID test prior to flying. So just wanted to add that in case.
Got it. Okay, Richard, we're quickly running out of time. If your particular question has not been answered, please feel free to shoot us an email. We'll be happy to pass it on to Richard for responding. Richard, thank you very much for such an enlightening talk.
No
it's always a pleasure to have you. And for the audience, thank you very much for your participation. Goodbye from Los Angeles.
Thanks everyone for tuning up.
Thank you.